Yes, the Ukraine war, the fabricated conflict that should have never happened, the early 21st century conflict that pinned brother against brother, very reminiscent of World War I. The conflict that woke people up from the fake narrative and showed that the Western world is no better than Russia, China, Iran, or all the opposing powers to the United States hegemony, and woke people from this deep slumber and showed that the Iron Curtain never actually fell. The conflict that no one wanted. Not Ukrainians, nor Russians, nor Europeans as a whole. The only people who wanted this conflict were, of course, the bankers, the military-industrial complex, the Fortune 500 companies, and of course, the construction companies. How can the Western world revamp their dying economy if not a war where they will send trillions of taxpayer money, sacrificing an entire generation of young Ukrainian men, white Europeans, and dividing people worldwide so that they can control them even easier? So who's to blame? Of course, the usual suspects. Jokes out of the way, there are some key people directly responsible for this conflict. And it's not Putin, it's not Biden, and certainly is not this clown Zelensky. There are many people whom you can blame for this conflict, but I will name a few key people responsible for this. The first and the most powerful of them all is Larry Fink himself, the owner of BlackRock that has all the Fortune 500 companies under his thumb. I have made a whole half-an-hour video explaining that and how they control almost every aspect of the lives of Western people. The other person is John Kerry. He was the head of the CIA whom led the Ukrainian coup d'etat in 2014. We all know how that went. They removed the Russian sympathetic government from Kiev led by Viktor Fedorovich and instead put a Western puppet, Petro Poroshenko, to do their bidding, of course, paving the way for the paid actor Volodymyr Zelensky, whom he made his fortune in Russia and Kazakhstan as an actor before becoming a politician. So he went from being a clown, to being a clown. The other key person is James Donald, the CEO of Lockheed Martin. Who is Lockheed Martin? The company who makes most of USA's military equipment and jet fighters. And the final key person is Michael Braveman Goodman Froman. And I'm not kidding, this is his full name. Oh my god, I've never heard a more Jewish name in my entire life. So who is this guy? Oh, no one, he's just the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, aka the president of international bribing. Anyway, I'm gonna explain in detail why this war happened, why it's still ongoing as I'm recording this video, who's gonna benefit from it, and how it will shape geopolitics moving forward. In order to do that, we need to go back in time to 2008, when the great financial recession of the 21st century hit the Western world, when most of the Fortune 500 companies failed and they needed a bailout from the US government. Who did that? George W. Bush, of course. He bailed out all those mega corporations that went under during the financial crisis. How did he do that? By appealing to the Federal Reserve, of course, who is able to print endless amount of money to revamp their dying economy. Who owns the Federal Reserve? The 12 Federal Banks of America. Who owns those banks? JP Morgan and the Rothschild dynasty, of course. What ethnicity those people are? You know what? Figure out for yourself. You're a big boy. What did all this reckless money printing do to the dollar? Devalued the dollar and made it more worthless than the paper it is printed on. Oh, and I should mention, Obama Trump and especially Biden continued this policy of devaluing the dollar and bullying countries in Europe, in the Middle East to use the dollar for their transactions. What did Russia do in response? With the full support of China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, they made BRICS, an economic partnership that aims to create a flow of cash between those partner countries. Since then, BRICS has welcomed tens of countries under their economic alliance like Iran, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and many more partner countries like Turkey, Syria, Pakistan, Vietnam, Thailand, and basically more than half of the global population. This alliance is made to dethrone the dollar as the world currency and made as an alternative to the dollar that is backed by nothing. All those national currencies don't have the buying power of the dollar, granted, but they are backed by gold and they have decoupled from the dollar. So basically it is a return to the gold standard. This is why China and Russia bought in the past 4 years tens of tons of gold. You will say now, okay, so what this has to do with the Ukraine war? And I will say, well, Jimmy, it has everything to do with the Ukraine war. Because prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Russians, that we all know prior to the invasion, they produced more than 60% of all the world's grain. What did the Russians do not even 2 weeks before they invaded Ukraine? They raised the prices of grain because they knew they're gonna invade. How did NATO respond? By sending 120,000 troops at the Russian border with Ukraine to provoke Russia. And this is how the Ukraine war started. Now, of course, there is a very underexplained second factor to why this war happened, and that is the constant shelling of the Donetsk and Luhansk region of Ukraine by their own government. The Russians gave an ultimatum to the Ukraine regime, and that was called the Minsk Agreement, an agreement in which it stated that the region of Donetsk and Luhansk must be demilitarized and put an end to the conflict. An agreement that Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Ukraine, and Russia signed. But as Angela Merkel admitted, they signed that agreement just to buy time for Ukraine to be armed to the teeth by the European Union and USA. The clown actor Zelensky applied for a NATO membership. Coincidentally, just as the Minsk agreement expired, of course, Russia is gonna invade when it's an existential threat to their strategic position. Oh, not to mention that all the Baltic countries that were historically either Russian protectorates or just straight up annexed by the ex-Soviet Union or the ex-Russian Tsarist Empire, and still Russian is still spoken in those countries, not the official language, but is still spoken. The Baltic countries entered NATO, and this infuriated the Russians. And I personally don't blame them from having genuine grievances for NATO expansion further east. Now imagine if Mexico would do a military alliance with Russia or China. USA would nuke Mexico 100 times over so that they make sure they destroy Mexico, so that they make sure they don't make that military alliance. Oh, and don't think for a second that I am a Putin apologist or a Russian bootlicker or whatever label are you gonna put on my forehead inevitably because you're a brainwashed cattle by Western media. Because of course the Russians are not 100% innocent in this affair. Remember, like I said earlier, they raised the prices of grains and also gas and petrol not 2 weeks before they invaded Ukraine. And of course they quietly decoupled from the West and moved their businesses to China, to the Middle East, and nationalized some of their big businesses. Now, that is not inherently a bad thing, but It is a threat to the dollar. And of course, the West is gonna poke the bear. How the US is gonna benefit from this? By sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine and some military equipment in order for them to not die on the battlefield. From who? You! The idiot that's watching my video right now! Your taxpayers' money and of course, European taxpayer money. How is Ukraine gonna pay for that? Since their country is basically in ruins, their economy is non-existent and lost almost a whole generation of young men to this conflict? Of course, loans from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and of course, the Federal Reserve of USA. Is the Ukraine regime ever gonna pay those loans? Of course not! They are gonna pay indirectly with their hyperinflated currency, with their cheap labor towards all the Fortune 500 companies that are gonna move to Ukraine to rebuild Ukraine. Oh look! BlackRock and JP Morgan helped to set up Ukraine Reconstruction Bank. How kind of them! Who's gonna invest in that? The mega rich, the billionaires. Who's gonna rebuild Ukraine after the war is over? BlackRock! Who is gonna lend money to the Ukraine government to pay for that rebuilding? JP Morgan and the Federal Reserve of USA, of course. How is Ukraine ever gonna be able to pay that? In resources, of course, because Ukraine has one of the most fertile land in the world. There is a reason why they are called the breadbasket of Europe. They also are very rich in minerals and metals. Metal to do what? To manufacture jet fighters, weapons, and so on and so forth. Who's gonna do that? Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman. How much Ukraine is estimated to be worth in resources? $7.5 trillion. I will repeat, $7.5 trillion. They are ranked fourth in the world as one of the most resource-rich country. This is why this war is still ongoing, because both Russia and USA are gonna benefit from it. Russia is gonna take a big chunk of Ukraine at the end of the conflict, don't kid yourselves. So they are gonna win trillions after this war is over. But the ones that will benefit the most is the military-industrial complex, who is still pumping Ukraine with billions of weapons, bullets, missiles, jet fighters, and close air support fighters. They are gonna use Ukraine's resources to build up, to increase the production of the military-industrial complex. To do what? To build weapons, fighters, close air support, tanks, missiles. For what? A world war with Russia, China, the Middle East, perhaps even India, although I'm not sure where their allegiances lie. This is the biggest money laundering operation of all time! And you know what the funny thing about this is? Whenever the US government is passing a bill or a package to Ukraine or to Israel or any other proxy, they don't even look where the money is going. They don't even have accountants. Not even 30% of all the money US is sending to Ukraine actually goes to the battlefield to help Ukrainians. The rest goes to the pockets of the politicians like Zelensky or Rustem Umerov or all those cronies from Washington. USA is the most corrupt country in the world at this moment by far. I will let a person more qualified than I, a person that is actually there to oversee this, and that is of course Senator Rand Paul himself. I will let him talk about how they don't even have accountants that are looking into those government spendings.
It was reform negotiated, and the mistake was doing it, I think, behind closed doors and with only one individual. The individual really needed to come back to the caucus and say, do you guys think you might, or you men and women, do you think you might support this border bill we're putting together? Instead, it was just sort of all done deal. Here it is. We're not going to use the power of the minority because we want and salivate to send the money to Ukraine also. This is the problem now. They believe in Ukraine first and America last. They believe that we should borrow $100 billion, whether it comes from China or whether the Federal Reserve prints it up. We're going to take $100 billion and send it over there on top of the $113 billion we've already sent. And some might say, well, you know, it's for a good cause. Well, shouldn't we examine what they're going to spend it on? Shouldn't we have like a special inspector general, someone who's trained to look for waste? Shouldn't we have that person appointed to look at the waste? I've advocated it for over a year. I've forced them to vote on it. Democrats all voted no, and all the big government Republicans who love this money, they voted no too. They don't want scrutiny of how the money's being spent. I even helped them to pick who would be the inspector general. Somebody's been doing it for 10 years. The inspector general that's in charge of Afghanistan is called SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. And he's done a great job. He's got a team of over 100 people that work for him, accountants and economists and people who look at this war spending. They know how to look at war spending, war contracts. They know how to look for malfeasance. And he's found billions of dollars worth of it. And we spent a couple trillion in Afghanistan. That's not the inspector general's fault. That's Congress's fault. But he's done his best to try to police this. He's written entire books on the waste. And as a consequence, the people who love sending your money overseas, they hate him. They hate the idea. They hate the idea so much that they've voted it down with a vast majority. They don't want an inspector general. But if you ask them, if you don't want to oversee the money, they would say, oh no, the Pentagon or the State Department or somebody already has an inspector general, they'll do it. And I said, oh, you mean the Pentagon that can't be audited? The Pentagon that refuses to be audited? The Pentagon says they're too big to be audited? You trust them to now oversee the money going to Ukraine? When Ukraine has a history of being in the bottom 10% as far as corruption, meaning they have had more corruption than the other 90% of countries? I think that's kind of crazy. But we're not going to even ask for an inspector general on this. We're just fine. Shovel it out the door. So where's some of the money going? Inevitably, some of it's buying weapons. And to listen to the supporters of this bill, they are proud of the weapons and the profit that will go to the people who sell weapons. This to me just boggles the mind. They actually have a new name. They now call it the Defense Industrial Base. Since the time of Eisenhower, it was known as the Military Industrial Complex. But they've renamed it the Defense Industrial Base, and we're going to rebuild ours with war profits from Ukraine. See, we're really not giving it to Ukraine. We're giving it to Ukraine. They're giving it right back to American arms manufacturers. See, it's this sort of mercantile sort of, oh yeah, looks like it's good for business, it's good for money. And it's like, are these people not realizing we're talking about war? A war that some estimate 500,000 people have died? And they're thinking, well, gosh, if instead of 100,000 rifles, we send them 1 million, that'll be more profit, and our companies will be bigger and more profitable and able to make more weapons for us then. Not really acknowledging that 1 million rifles might kill more people than 100,000. Or let's say we have 1,000 tanks. Well, what if we give them 10,000 tanks? There'll be more profit for the arms merchants. Wouldn't that be good? That'll be great. We're reinvigorating the Defense Industrial Base. Really? You're going to make the argument that war is good? Or maybe war ain't so bad? Or maybe just a little war here and there if we can get some more profit for these guys, the big companies, you know, the large multinational arms manufacturers, if they could just get a little more profit. A little more profit would be good because that'll reinforce the Defense Industrial Base. This is saying the quiet part out loud. This is saying something they should be embarrassed by. This is saying something so reprehensible and so disgusting. But it's happened from the leadership on our side, the leadership on the other side. It's happened also with the Biden administration. In committee, they come to us and they brag about how this isn't really money to Ukraine, this is money to America. We're giving it to Ukraine, but it's sort of a conduit. It's sort of a laundering scheme to get the money back to America, to our arms manufacturers. So under this logic, the longer the war goes on, the more weapons we sell, the better it is for our defense industrial base. 2-year war that's lost 500,000 people, which would be better for the defense industrial base? A 2-year war that loses 500,000 people or a 3-year war that loses 750,000 people? Well, it's a lot better for the defense industrial base to have a 3rd year of war.
How many Ukrainian officials have been caught with bags full of millions of dollars in their hotels trying to flee the country? It is all a big money laundering scheme at the expense of human lives. In 2 years since this conflict started, on both sides combined died more than 1 million people. 1 million white European men died! So that Larry Fink, JP Morgan, John Kerry, and all those warmongers from Washington like Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, Hillary Clinton that are supported, bought, and paid by the military-industrial complex. This war criminal, paid actor, cheerleader, clown that is not even Ukrainian, he's Ashkenazi Jewish that installed himself as a dictator in an Orthodox Christian country, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of white Christian Ukrainians and stealing countless of millions of dollars in the process with the price of the blood of Ukrainian young men. 1 generation of Ukrainian young men is lost forever. They will never recover from this national calamity. Now, on the front lines, there are only old men fighting. Old men forcefully dragged from the streets by this coked up megalomaniac puppet worm. And what will this fucking worm gonna do when this conflict is over? He's gonna fly to his mansion in San Marino or Florida, and he's gonna live as a king while Ukrainians are gonna starve and struggle in the aftermath of this war. Prior to the Russian invasion in 2022, Ukraine was considered the most corrupt country in Europe by far. After the invasion, suddenly, overnight, has become this beacon of hope, freedom, democracy, and Russia and Putin has become overnight evil incarnate. All the Russian assets frozen, all their money from their banks liquidated. USA always says, oh, Russian propaganda this, Russian propaganda that. Sorry, but I can't see the Russian propaganda since you banned all the Russian media in the West to combat disinformation. You see the endless hypocrisy and the endless irony of this? The real enemy is not Putin, not Biden, not Trump, certainly not this worm Zelensky. It is BlackRock, JP Morgan, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Vanguard, State Street, Larry Fink himself, the Federal Reserve, and all the lawmakers that pass bills and funnel trillions of dollars into the meat grinder that is the graveyard that has become Ukraine. At what expense? Your tax money and young European lives. If you are so brainwashed that you support either Russia or Ukraine, I'm saying this to you non-ironically. Yourself. You are a brainwashed cattle that looks at the world through a thick lens of ignorance, and you are more gullible than a 3-year-old. Oh, and not to mention that USA and Canada has sent hundreds of volunteers to the Ukrainian army thinking that this is Call of Duty. BlackRock thanks you for your service, soldier. Ukrainians and Russians are the same. They are brothers. This, what is happening right now, is called a brothers' war for the benefit of the military-industrial complex, the banks, and the real estate giants like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Ukrainians and Russians are both European. They have no business fighting each other. Whether you like it or not, both Russians and Ukrainians are European. Do you think Europe ends at the Baltics? No, you fucking idiot! It ends at fucking Vladivostok! Or more likely, fucking Kamchatka! Russia and Ukraine are not like two football teams that you Americans support. This is just your gullible, ignorant, devoid of empathy, devoid of morals, and sheltered worldview. This fabricated conflict is made with one thing and one thing alone: to destroy Europe. More precisely, to destroy white Christian Europe. You pin two idiots against each other. They fight, they kill and destroy each other. Then you come, hire them into their own country, make them slaves into their own country to rebuild what they destroyed, profit, rinse and repeat, and then move to the next country where there is political turmoil. What I'm gonna say right now, it will be very controversial and perhaps you will hate me for this, but nonetheless it is true. Ukraine is a failed state. It is an invented country, an amalgam of Russians, Poles, Romanians, and Hungarians. The Lviv part of Ukraine right now belongs to Poland. The Carpathian Ruthenia belongs to Hungary. Northern Bukovina and all the Bessarabia belongs to Romania, and the rest is Russian. I'm sorry, but this is just basic history and basic knowledge. Ukraine didn't even exist up until 1918, when they gained their independence from Lenin for not even 2 years, and then annexed back into the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they gained the independence, aka they were ruled by despots or either Russian puppets or Western puppets. I'm sorry to say this, but Ukraine, it's an artificial state. And I can see the comments from a mile away. How much RT paid you? Russian apologist, Putin bootlicker. Go fuck yourself. I'm Romanian, okay? I don't have a horse in this race. And now I want to make a personal message to Larry Fink, John Kerry, Jamie Dimon, James Donald, Michael Goodman, and all the corrupt cronies that I mentioned throughout this video. And the message is the following. Go yourself.
Subscribe, you silly Billy.
And now I want to send a personal message to all Russians, all Ukrainians, and all Europeans as a whole. Your race is going extinct, and you are fighting each other for BlackRock and JP Morgan. This actually makes my blood boil. Wake the fuck up!